Welcome to Economic Solutions. This is our first program in a series whereby we're going to be showing certain facts about economics as well as actions to take. My name is Leonard Zane. I'm here with Dr. Jan Martin of Jet Propulsion Laboratory, even though he doesn't represent JPL in this capacity.
Not today.
Represents himself. Jan is a bachelor's graduate from Caltech in electrical engineering and PhD at Stanford. Myself, I have an AB in international relations and economics from USC and a master's in business from USC. And also years ago was lucky enough to study economics by correspondence with Alan Greenspan, and we will be talking a little bit about Mr. Greenspan's role in some of the problems we have today. So our goal here is going to be as factual and fair and objective as we can. We'll talk about what economic conditions are, and then we'll talk about approaches to solve economic problems. One thing Jan and I were talking about just earlier before the show started was to make it clear what a depression is. Well, a depression, first of all, is typically defined as an extended period where you have unemployment of 15% or more. The Great Depression had 25% at its worst. And a depression, unlike a normal business cycle where you have rises and recessions, a depression is a result of, it's a bust that's caused by a boom. And we're going to look at what causes those booms, and then we're going to look at how do you get out of the situation once you're in it. We might indeed be in the beginning of a depression right now, and we'll be looking at reasons for the people tell us that. So to start with, let's look at the Great Depression in this display here. This describes unemployment during the Great Depression of the 1930s. And Jan, you might want to explain a little bit about that.
Right. What we're starting off with is, you can see that at the beginning we're starting in the late 20s, and unemployment is bouncing up and down. But not too high, in the order of the low 4% kind of range, which is reasonable. But now, all of a sudden, when we hit the real Great Depression in 1929 and subsequent years, the unemployment rises dramatically to, as we said before, 25%. Now that's about as scary a number, I think, as if you're a person out in the world, trying to do work. Mm-hmm. 3/4 of people are employed, but about 1/4 of the people aren't,
yeah.
Which is a huge number.
So it actually starts, I think, Jan, around 1930 or so that the Depression starts? And
that's
then,
right.
You pointed out earlier that we started to improve at a certain point in the 1930s.
Yes, as soon as Roosevelt gets elected right here in 1932, he starts to implement the New Deal, which is a large spending, many spending bills. And the other part that's important is his banking reform. So he does both of those things. And you can see that the unemployment starts to go down. It starts to go down rather dramatically.
And what year is that?
We're talking about, the turnaround is about 1933, 34. Mm-hmm. And it jumps down, goes down fairly well, down to right here, which is 1937. And unfortunately, at this point, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, loses his nerve in a way and starts to try to balance the budget. He slashes the programs, he increases taxes, and gets basically slapped upside the head by the economy, and the unemployment jumps from roughly 12% back up to 18% or so. Mm-hmm. And so then we're in real trouble. He wakes up at this point, reinstitutes the New Deal, increases spending by the government, and then the economy responds again when the unemployment continues to drop.
And it really ends, though, around 1940, right?
That's right.
So it's a 10-year depression, even though there was
Yes.
a slight rise. So that was certainly a very serious and traumatic situation. Okay, we're going to look at the cause. In order to understand what's happening to us today, the Great Depression is a very good thing to look at in terms of historical reference. So we talked about booms and busts. a depression is caused by a boom, and we want to see what's behind a boom. What's different about a boom than simply an economic upswing? That's part of the business cycle. Well, the Roaring '20s were given that name, not just because of the music and everything else, but because it was a very high energy time where people were spending a lot, the economy was soaring, but the prices were rising very fast. One of the things we should look at is something that Alan Greenspan had recommended many years ago, a book that's very important in economic history in the United States. It's called Economics and the Public Welfare. It's written by Benjamin Anderson, who was economist at Chase Bank. And this is a history from 1913 to 1946. And most of those years, he was there at Chase as an economist. And this is considered a classic book on what happened to America, how the Depression happened. Basically, what he says in this book, it was about problems created by the Federal Reserve and gold flowing into the United States that gave us too much money and drove all these prices up, and eventually led to the crash. A second book that's more contemporary
and a bit more controversial
and a bit more is America's Great Depression by Professor Murray Rothbard. He is an economist who studied exactly what happened in the Great Depression, and he found by constructing all the data and putting the data together that the Federal Reserve, which was created in 1913, December 1913 under Woodrow Wilson's administration, he found that the Federal Reserve from 1921 to 1929 increased the supply of money in the United States by 62%. That was unprecedented. Before that, money was based on gold, and the Federal Reserve couldn't just manufacture money on a fractional reserve system.
Well, to be fair, it still was based on gold during this period.
That's right. You had the ability, they had something like 35% gold requirement for the money, but that meant 65% could be what's called fiat money that is not one-on-one represented by gold.
And we were still on the gold standard in a way, and in terms of the international economics, there was still this fixed exchange rate between all the currencies in the world at that time.
That's absolutely right. What was different, though, was the amount of monetary expansion that happened, 62% over those years. That's enormous. And this led to a lot of high prices, rising prices, soaring prices, not just stock prices and securities. Everything was going up. Real estate was going up. Commodities were going up. Well,
that's a boom.
It did. It was a boom. This is what is a boom. It is fueled not just by a normal business swing. This one's fueled by money, and there was tremendous money expansion going on here. So now if we go beyond that, there's the curve. We show it from 1922 to 1929, but you can see how steep that curve is in terms of the monetary expansion. It was unprecedented for the time. And keep in mind, I guess I should say right now, Jan, it was Andrew Jackson who actually abolished the central bank during his administration.
And paid down the debt.
And yeah, he actually paid off the United States.
It's the only time I think it's ever been paid off.
Right, it's been completely paid off. And the country seemed to survive quite well with no national debt.
It survives well, to be fair, with national with a lot of debt and without debt.
Yeah, without debt, either way. So anyway, central bank was reinstated in late 1913, and this was their first onset of fueling the economy. They wanted to keep interest rates low. They created an awful lot of money, and it drove a boom. Well, here we go. You can see what happened in terms of industrial production, and Jan, you might want to explain.
Here's now it's a little bit harder because this curve goes so far into the into the war period where things are really dramatic. But if you can take a look at the very beginning here, you can see how industrial production is actually increasing. This is the Roaring '20s, and we're actually getting an increase in production. It's not just, money is exploding and nothing's being produced. Things are really being produced this time. And industrial production is rising until right here, which is the crash in 1929. And then all of a sudden, things start going downhill. The amount of industrial production drops dramatically. The index drops, about 30%, roughly, 30 or 40%. It's huge. It's a huge drop in production. And this, I think, is a product of bad policy. Mm-hmm. This is the Hoover administration, and this is just, we're balancing the budget. We don't know what else to do. We're balancing the budget. And in here also, the Federal Reserve actually raises interest rates in order to defend the currency, because as I said before, we're still on the international gold standard.
Right.
So when the pound was basically pushed off the gold standard in 1931, the dollar was attacked right after that.
Right.
And so we had to defend it. And in order to defend it, what did we do? We raised interest rates. And here we are in the middle of this.
Precipitated this tremendous
would never do this right now.
And so, as you pointed out earlier, I guess you can point again to when Roosevelt started to spend or develop some public projects, things started to get a little better.
In 1932, you see industrial production starting to go up. And again, it's the same thing as we saw with unemployment. Everything is going better, and then in 1937 he loses his nerve, and industrial production, as unemployment goes up, industrial production goes down, GDP goes down, and Roosevelt gets a lesson in reality, goes back to doing what he had been doing with all those stimulus packages, and then we have something that really takes off in, say, 1939, when Hitler's starting to invade I guess Czechoslovakia and Poland in 1939, and then 1940, and then take it away.
Well, yeah,
really
actually
happens after
what's
that.
happening even in 1939, the British start buying an awful lot of airplanes from us, P-40s. They buy as much as we can produce.
The war in Europe is starting.
And so this starts to develop our productivity and starts bringing in, actually, they were paying us with gold, as a matter of fact, for that, and it was stimulating our economy. But when we got into the war, when you see 1940 here, and it peaks like this is a spectacular change, and there's a reason that happened that's often not commonly known. What happened here, the reason this tremendous spike, was a young economist by the name of John Kenneth Galbraith was put in charge of a brand new agency called the Office of Price Administration, the OPA.
Yeah.
And it was his job to reallocate resources in the economy away from consumer goods into producer and capital goods. Goods that make goods. So they did that by rationing. And what they did was they developed this program of issuing ration coupons. They were red. I actually remember those coupons.
A little before my time.
And you got them from the post office. And you went there and you got so many of these a month, according to how many members in your family you had.
Right.
Or if you were single, you got so many a month. Mm-hmm. And then you could only buy things buy the ration coupons along with the money. And you couldn't really spend all the money that you had because you couldn't buy goods. You actually had to stand in line for your mother to buy nylon stockings or even bread. Sometimes you had to stand in line for it. But what that did, it reallocated a tremendous amount of resources from consumer goods to producer goods.
Yes.
And we had a triple rise in the industrial production index in 2.5 years.
Yeah.
Tremendous. So when we got into the war, if General Motors was able to make, let's say, 100 Chevrolets a week or something or other, when we got into the war in these peak times, they could make 300 tanks a week. And so this was a tremendous recovery based on productivity is what happened.
Yeah.
And so therefore, when the war ended, well, people were in good shape, even though it came down a little bit in 1946 here because we weren't...
Well, post-war.
Yeah, it wasn't crucial to get these things out.
Right.
Nevertheless, the economy was way up here at this level.
Yeah, the point is that we've built all this capital up.
Right.
You know, all this fixed capital to do the machine tools and all this kind of stuff. And so even though we have we have to come back down because we're not producing war material, we still have all the basics. Here. Yes, exactly.
We got rich, and keep in mind, not one bomb hit the United States. This wasn't simply full employment. They were fully employed in England and fully employed in Germany.
Yeah. Well, the unemployment here was about 2%
Yeah,
during the war.
But the key is that none of our resources were destroyed. Not one bomb
Right.
hit the United States. So here is this
Except for Hawaii.
Yeah, except this, well, which wasn't part of the United States back then. But here's this tremendous wealth. Now, when the war ended, people not only had this amazing productivity in the economy, they also had money that they had saved up. They weren't able to spend during the war.
Yeah.
And the soldiers came home and they had money. And the soldiers were also trained in skills. They weren't just off the farm anymore. They actually learned skills. Most of the soldiers in the war were not assault troops. They were actually support troops who learned skills.
Yeah.
So this was a tremendous boost that happened. And that's how we got out. We started to get out a little bit, but as you say, Franklin Roosevelt lost his nerve.
Well, this is the mother of all stimulus packages in a way.
This is huge productivity.
Yeah.
Just unprecedented. So that's how you get out.
I wanted to
big
make
time.
one point before we move on to the next slide, is that how big this investment really was in terms of how much the American government was spending. At the peak, the American government was spending roughly 40% of GDP.
Wow.
And so that, I mean, when we're talking about a stimulus package down in here, we're talking 2 to 3% of GDP.
That's not just spending, that's investing.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's not just spending,
but
it's
not consuming. I mean, I know John Maynard Keynes talked to Franklin Roosevelt, and he made a point, something that I look at with a very jaundiced eye. He told Franklin Roosevelt, well, you can simply, if you want to, just pay people to dig holes in the ground and fill them up again. And as long as you pay them, that's fine. Keynes came from this idea of demand-side economics stimulates spending, but this is supply-side economics.
Well, it's both. It's both demand and supply, because you're controlling the demand in a way, but you also have a huge demand built up because of the war material.
Well, that's right. Yeah, you've actually created the base for potential demand that's enormous, and at the same time, you've gone supply side. John Kenneth Galbraith,
exactly,
a very liberal economist, not known for being a supply sider.
He's a smart guy,
but he was in those days. He later became ambassador to India, as I recall.
Very famous economist.
So as we move on and we go to percentage of unemployment, let's go to now. We've looked now at the Great Depression and the lesson that I hope we've learned from it.
At least a little bit.
I want to also go back to Aristotle here for a moment. In our general approach in this series is Aristotle said, it is first necessary to know what is before being capable of considering what ought to be. And that's the approach we take as part of the economic action group of the San Gabriel Community for Change that we belong to. We want to look at things as objectively as we can to find out what's going on, what's the reality. From there, then we can decide, oh, well, if this is real, then these options open up. You know, that's kind of the approach we have. We don't really come to this program with an agenda. We go and look to see what we can see. So you're going to see things that if they're politically interpreted, they might look more toward a liberal on one hand, they might look more toward conservative in another. Reality is our major concern here. So coming to the present, 2006 to 2009, this is a projection made by an independent organization listed here at the bottom, and it's not looking good at all. I mean, they're projecting we're going to hit 9% unemployment by May of 2009, and it gets worse. I mean, I think there are reasons that all over the world, really, everybody is gravely concerned right now that this is the worst crisis since the Great Depression. And we're going to see a little bit more about why we had the boom that created this.
Right.
We can show the next one, I think, is a little more specific. Jan, you might explain. This was Christina Romer, by the way, who did this, right?
Yes.
And she is the new chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Anyway, she's a doctorate from originally MIT. She was at Princeton. Now she's at Berkeley. is supposed to be an authority on depressions. I don't know much about her in that regard.
Well, so is our Fed chief.
Yeah, that's from Volcker, right? We'll get to
Well,
him.
Bernanke.
Oh, Bernanke, the one we have, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so you might want to explain that.
Right. This is sort of a combination of, this is really projections. It's what Christina Romer and her colleagues think would happen either with or without the stimulus package that we're going to be talking about a little bit later. This is the curve that you see here. The higher curve is the one without the stimulus package, and it shows that the effects of this depression. I think it's fair to call it a depression because
it sure looks like one.
Well, because
it looks like we're getting
what it caused. What caused it? It was created by a boom.
Well,
very
yeah, and I'm going to get to that, but certainly the steepness of this curve. I've never seen anything like this in decades.
Right.
And as you're saying. Without the stimulus package, you're up there, and that's the same point. What she's got is the same as the independent study, around 9% without the stimulus. So are we back to what Galbraith did in the 1940s with regard to stimulus, and that's why you get more productivity? What's going on?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I can answer that, but I can tell you that this is not the only projection. There are projections that are worse than this. There are projections that project that if we do nothing, that this will continue up and we'll hit 12%.
Yeah.
And that is a very scary number. We're talking almost Great Depression numbers there.
Yeah, in fact, we'll see a little bit later based on Sweden, which is an example very similar.
Yes,
with
that's right.
Very similar causes to what we're facing.
That's right.
And that's what they had. They had 12, and the government acted right away, and they still had 12. And they had a depression that lasted 3 years.
That's right.
Okay.
But the point here is that if we do implement the kind of thing that President Obama is talking about, which is a stimulus package that has a combination of investment and tax cuts. That combination of things actually hopefully will abort this so that it doesn't get anywhere near what the kind of numbers that we're talking about and starts to turn over relatively quickly. Now, this may be optimistic. We talked about this before.
Now, is that what some people would call spending, or is it productivity, or both?
We're talking here. Let's not. Spending is almost a pejorative term in politics today. You don't want to. It's
if I buy a new car, that's spending, right?
Right, but
okay.
if I pay you to build a bridge, then that's
investment.
It's investment.
Okay, all right.
So, but you may, with your money that I pay you with, go buy a car.
Yeah. So then we've done both.
Exactly.
Okay, so
that's the multiplier effect.
This is what apparently Christina Romer is projecting with regard to what she thinks might happen with a stimulus, and it's both sides of the aisle actually. We're going to look at an advisor to John McCain.
That's right.
Mark Zandi, and see what he projects. Okay, so now this is an interesting chart. Look at how smooth things are going here in terms of deficit. Here is the federal deficit. The dark line is a little more because it includes deficit funds that the federal government actually holds itself. But they're basically very similar. Look how smooth everything goes here from for decades, on and on and on, until we get almost to late 70s, early 80s. Something like that, and then suddenly skyrocket.
Yeah.
Now, this means spending. This means government spending. And to let everybody
deficit means not just means government spending, but it's possible that government intake is being reduced.
It was being reduced, right. So they ran a big deficit. What we're going to see, though, that money went up enormously, and we'll see that.
Well, both of those things happened. We know where this happened.
We know,
right there.
We know. So this chart actually shows whose administration, during whose administration, various things were happening.
Right.
And the deficits keep going down as a percentage of gross domestic product, and it's kind of following this. This is the level of deficit, but the economy is getting more productive too. So the deficit as a percentage of GDP is actually going down. It's looking really good. Until we get here, sorry to say, Reagan-Bush. What happened here, Ronald Reagan had a budget director by the name of David Stockman, who did warn about this in public, and he said, in order to get out of stagflation, which existed in the Carter administration, where we had double-digit interest rates, we had gasoline lines, But Stockman pointed out, he said, well, what they tried first, by the way, was a trickle down. They tried the Arthur Laffer curve with the idea of cutting taxes for the very rich. I was a big fan of this. I was at USC at the time, and I thought this is going to be great. And the idea was to stimulate the economy by cutting taxes for the rich. They would invest. This would cause a multiplier effect, which would trickle down and stimulate the economy. It was called Reaganomics 1, is what that was called.
Right.
And it failed. And
utterly.
Ross Perot, years later, about 8 years later, actually showed charts on how and why it failed. But Ronald Reagan had another agenda too. He wanted to engage the Soviet Union in an arms race. He wanted to bankrupt them in this arms race.
That was the strategy.
He wanted spending, and he wanted to stimulate the economy. And so David Stockman warned, well, we can do this, but we're going to triple the national debt in 5 years. And in fact, that happened. And so here it goes. And it continued with George H.W. Bush. And then it went on. But then it turned around. When Bill Clinton came in, what he did was he raised taxes for very rich people. Most people didn't see those taxes, but the very rich did. I didn't see them, but very rich people did. And he balanced the budget, actually, did better than that. He had a $132 billion surplus.
Amazing.
Then this is a projection. This was a projection done last year for George W. Bush. And this projected that he was going to have a deficit of about $380 billion. But because of the crash that happened in 2008, the latest data indicate that W. Bush has a deficit of around $1 trillion, something like that. So it's going to be a curve.
What a lovely legacy.
Way up there. So that's kind of a history of what's going on by administrations. This
Right.
surprises a lot of people who might be politically inclined, that, you know, who was doing what and how did it go.
But you can see that in the first part, I mean, everybody's doing reasonably well.
Everybody did well. Both parties, not a problem.
Yeah.
And zoom, there it goes. And we're going to see the money increase because this was supported by my old mentor, Alan Greenspan.
That's right. He was there.
We're going to see why. And Paul Volcker was there, too.
That's right.
Volcker was there from 79 to 87.
Yes.
And so now let's look at what happened in money. Now this, to me, is one of the most important displays that we've got. This doesn't give a reference here, but this is from Wikipedia. And basically, this is money supply. Now, when you go off any kind of standard, a precious metal standard, or some kind of limit, it means that your central bank can create money, as much money as it wants. The Treasury can borrow, and it does.
Well, who creates money exactly? When does that happen?
Well, let's look at the kinds of money.
Right.
A lot of people think that money is just the currency in our pockets. Not so. Currency in our pockets is this green one down here, and look at how small that is compared with everything else. That's called M0, by the way, in the vernacular. But look at this money supply, and it's, you know, total money, this rest of this money, M1, M2, and M3, those are commercial bank deposits of various types. But what happens with the Federal Reserve, and I'm not going to get too technical in this one, but basically what happens is money is created through the banking system. Whenever anybody borrows anything through the banks, actually money is created, and it's supported by the Federal Reserve. It's done by accounting, journal entries, strokes of pens. It is not done by printing presses, not at all.
No, that's just the green part.
Very small. But look at this rise in the money. This is the boom. Mm-hmm. Now, this is what supported those deficits. Mm-hmm. Alan Greenspan was right in there in the 70s, and
yes.
He was part of that. Volcker was part of that in 79. Volcker was there through 1987. And then, I'm sorry, Volcker was before Alan Greenspan, I should say.
Yes.
It was Volcker, 79 to 87. And then Greenspan came in at 87, and boy, there it goes.
Yeah.
Now this, according to people like Benjamin Anderson, Murray Rothbard, most economists, Peter Schiff in today's world, will say this is what's causing the underlying cause of the boom and the depression risk that we may in fact be in. The idea that you have hucksters and people who take advantage and aren't properly regulated, that's another aspect. That's very true.
Part of what enables this mechanism.
Yeah, this mechanism this mechanism lets them come in and create all these derivatives.
And don't forget all the Chinese money and Saudi Arabian money, the oil money that's coming in at the rate of, I don't know, $5 trillion a year or something.
This is our money, though. This is our money supply.
But it's getting converted to our money supply because, again, remember that boom is coming from real estate, from loans that have been commoditized and cut and sliced and diced.
So the name of this game, anyway, is there's too much money. And the way I experienced this, by the way, real life situation, when I went to college at USC, my tuition for a whole year, private university, was the cost of a summer vacation. That's what it cost me to go to school. Anybody could afford to go to school at that time, to go to college. They really could. Today, if even my daughter, who started off at UCLA, the cost is half of an average person's annual salary. A cost of a car was in the same kind of proportions. It was not the proportions that we have today. And the reason for this is that all this increased money was created by debt, which drove prices up. And that's why prices are so high today. That's why it costs a fortune to send somebody to college. That's why a home that maybe you bought it in 1970 for $40,000 and today it should be worth $60,000. In the peak before the 2008 crash, that home was $700,000. You know, this kind of debt push of prices is the same thing that happened in the Roaring '20s, caused by this enormous monetary increase. I can't stress this enough, and it was the good old Federal Reserve that was behind this. Anyway, back to the next one. On to the next one. Let's look at some key Obama economic advisors. Jan, you've pointed out one of them already.
The only one I know anything about is Christina Romer, and you've already told everybody who she is.
Yeah. You might know more about her than I do. But anyway, Austin Goolsbee, he is a longtime associate of Barack Obama. They go back a long time. He's from University of Chicago. He's known as a centrist kind of economist. He's going to be the chief economist of the Economic Recovery Board, and that board is chaired by a 6'8" tall Paul Volcker, who was a Federal Reserve Chairman before Alan Greenspan. And Paul Volcker is generally recognized to be the most successful Federal Reserve Chairman in history. Before Volcker, it was, I think, Arthur Burns, who had a terrible record of inflation.
Yes.
Before Burns, it was a guy named William McChesney Martin. It goes all the way back through history. But Volcker, I think, is generally recognized as the most successful, but he started to inflate too, as we saw in the...
Well, he had the courage, I think, and it took some courage to really, look the inflation in the eye and say, we're going to raise interest rates, and we're going to raise them, and we're going to raise them until you break the back.
Yeah, he did do that, though. He started to give way in the late 80s, and we saw that in that early curve.
That's right.
Goolsbee, though, now there are many advisors. I mean, there's a 15-member panel here, and then there's Christina Romer has a council of economic advisors. She has a staff. Volcker has a staff of very famous people from all kinds of different backgrounds. I know Barack Obama wants a lot of diversity, and there are some complaints that this is slowing things down. It's kind of a Japanese approach. The Japanese like to have a lot of consensus.
Let's hope we don't get the Japanese result.
Yeah, with a lot of, they want everybody to agree before they take action, and I think Barack Obama follows some of that. It kind of slows things, but the theory is that you'll get wiser choices. And Goolsbee, though, I think is one to watch because he goes back with Barack Obama many years. And so we move on now to Sweden's economic recovery example. This is one that all of the administration economists and experts are looking at.
Point to this one.
They don't talk about it too much. They've talked about it a little bit, but this is the model they actually look at a lot because Sweden had a very similar thing. Economic collapse driven by financial collapse. The government went in and actually bought they bought bad debts from banks. They bought loans from banks. They actually took over, I think, one of the banks.
They nationalized.
Yeah, they nationalized, and they finally they started selling it back eventually. And
yes,
it took,
as you say, it took a few years to get there.
It took 3 years in the Depression. They still own one of the banks, I think.
Yeah.
They went the nationalization approach, but this is
end
a
up going that
good
way too.
example of what can happen, and this is, I know, what everybody's looking at. They had a 3-year depression from 1991 to 1993. Unemployment went from 3% to 12%,
yeah.
4 times increase. So this is why people really sweat. This is why George W. Bush and Henry Paulson were saying, oh my gosh, we've got to act right away. We were going out with a $380 billion deficit. It's going to be $1 trillion, but we've got to bail out all these companies or financial traders, trading organizations. They were panicked based on what they were looking at here that happened to Sweden, and I know they're still worried that we're really headed for this. So the government spent, they bought and they invested about 4% of the annual GDP for 3 years. That's what they did.
That's what it takes.
That's what it was, 4% of the GDP. But what's interesting, and you might want to comment on this, the final cost, that was their initial cost. You know,
right.
when they put the money up to begin
right.
with, and oh my gosh, here goes all this money. But the productivity went up so that their net cost, due to the productivity, was actually half that. It was 2%.
That's right.
I think you know something, Jan, about
the multipliers are interesting in this case. This one, basically, you're talking about a multiplier of roughly 2 here. There are many mechanisms which produce different kinds of multipliers. They all kinds of different ways to calculate them. So they have a wide range of numbers that people can use. And this one, actually, when you talk about what the multiplying effect of an investment, like the government says, okay, now I'm going to spend money to build a bridge or do whatever it is.
Not dig a hole in the ground.
Not dig a hole in the ground. That's well. There's a multiplier there too, but it's
spending.
Yeah, because there's spending. But part of this is also what the Republican, I think, I'm not sure whether it was Republican or Democrat. There was a concept called dynamic scoring, if you remember, a ways back, and it was some of these things where you would not consider just the cost, the upfront cost, but also the effect on the economy and the increase in the decrease in unemployment, the decrease in unemployment benefits required because people were being more employed, the increase in salary because people were now employed, they could pay taxes. So all of these mechanisms give you money back. And so
it
your
does create,
cost,
there is a productivity there even on a spending basis.
Even on a spending basis.
Not just an investing basis.
That's right.
So that's how a government investment program can actually bring the productivity up. Right? Because there's a gap, apparently. Okay, now let's look at some more specifics here. The first phase of this package is $350 billion, the first phase of it. And it's broken down like this. You can see it's alphabetical here, but the largest one is right here is aid to the states. That's $79 billion.
And that's one of the things that got changed in the Senate bill, actually, a different thing from the House. That's greatly reduced, unfortunately.
There's transportation and byways, that's roads, bridges, and mass transit.
Classic infrastructure.
Classic infrastructure, that's $71 billion. That's another really big one. The energy is big, but it's not as big as these. It's $54 billion. Broadband is only $6 billion.
That's right.
Some of these are looking into, the aim of these things is to increase American productivity.
I think that's, if you're talking about alternative energy, there's a lot of things in the out years for that. It's more of an upfront, there's some immediate things, but there's also some investment in the future, some investment in research, some investment in development, there's money for companies to do, advanced research, advanced work. To try to do better and get some more alternatives.
And then there's water treatment, flood control, environments, 19. There's some others here.
Well, education's large, $62 billion.
Education is large, $62 billion. I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end of the program. It's not all education, or no, I'm sorry, it's healthcare is the one I'm going to talk about. Now, this is
Yes.
healthcare systems. This is not about insuring everybody.
No, this is about
universal healthcare.
This is about automating and having electronic records,
Right.
so you don't have to tell your doctor every doctor you come to all the information.
Right, right. Pre-existing conditions and all that.
All that
business.
stuff, right?
Science, it
Yay.
could have been bigger. It's only 10 billion. I wish that the Super Collider were part of this package.
That's going to be tough, but
If we had the Super Collider, America could once again take the lead in particle physics. Right now it's happening in Europe with CERN, with the Large Hadron. But if we had the Super Collider, we fired it up again, we could be the first to discover what gravity is, to mention among many things. We could do more in nanotechnology, we could do enormous things. I wish there were more money in science than there is. So my own opinion is that this is a rather modest package,
Well,
actually.
you should probably you should probably say how big the shortfall in demand really is.
Yeah.
I mean, this package does not fill that void.
Well, the value of houses alone, the total housing value in the United States after the collapse,
Right.
is $20 trillion. Now, there was something like a $5 trillion collapse of housing values.
Yeah.
So when you're talking those kinds of money, I mean, $5 trillion, you suddenly collapse in value in the economy, you're talking about not even $1 trillion here. And
That's right.
See, our economy is based, Jen, on two major things: houses and cars. That's what it's about. Now, this is reallocating resources a little bit like what happened in World War II, not to the conventional consumer. A house is a consumer thing.
Yes.
A car is a consumer thing.
Right.
This is infrastructure.
Capital.
This is capital goods,
Yep.
investment and productivity. This is similar to what happened in World War II kind of thing.
But without the rationing.
That's right, without the rationing, without the war.
Right.
And so when you've got this kind of money allocated and you lose $5 trillion of housing value alone, not to mention the rest of the economy,
Right.
Believe it or not, this is modest.
Yeah, well, the shortfall in, I guess, the missing capacity, right? The economy has a certain capacity of producing a GDP, and where we're about $2 trillion shy of that capacity.
You're getting very close to, I'm going to bring this up. I missed it on the last slide, but I had a display on there that showed that it went, that we really have a $2 to $3 trillion potential need
Yes.
for stimulus, actually.
That's right.
The administration is not saying that. Certainly.
Well, actually, they did. He did. I
he say
did
that?
contradict you. Obama did say that we were facing a $2 trillion over the next 2 years, and it could be as high as $3, which is
Well, when
your
you
number.
lose $5 trillion in housing alone,
Yeah. But this is the potential.
Now, this pie chart is simply a distribution visually based on the figures in the previous display, and you can see state aid was a lot.
I should
Science
say.
was itty bitty.
Yeah, right.
Down here, water and a flood control environment. Energy is substantial.
And that's good.
Education is
I wanted to talk a
big.
little bit about energy, and then there's an infrastructure bit here with energy that is quite important. That's the advanced grid, the smart grid. Mm-hmm. No matter what energy mix in the end, alternative energy mix we come up with in terms of wind or solar heating or geothermal or whatever mix it is, maybe nuclear, I don't know. Mm-hmm. We're going to have to make the grid smart. We're going to have to increase the efficiency of the grid and be able to buy and sell power more quickly, more efficiently. And the technology is here. It exists. We just have to implement it.
That's a major problem, I understand, too, because I read some data about if we had 100-mile by 100-mile square of solar panels that could be easily placed in the state of Nevada, that would be enough to power all industrial requirements in the United States.
Yep.
But the problem is
you can't get
we
it.
can't distribute it.
Right.
The grid isn't there.
Exactly. And that's part of what this investment will talk about, a real good capital investment for the future. I think that's one of the best ones around in this
Unless
group.
we individually put up our own solar panels.
That's not as efficient.
Really.
The other thing I wanted to mention here, let me see, is is states' aid. We talk about immediate aid. Remember, Barack Obama's talked about let's get those jobs in the next year or so.
Yes.
State aid is one of the quickest ways to save jobs.
Okay. Well, I want to move to the next slide. Let's see. Yes, productivity will cut the deficit. Well, we've been talking about this.
Exactly.
Net federal debt addition is much less than the cost of the plan. Now, this information comes from Moody's economist Mark Zandi. Now, Mark Zandi is a conservative who was an advisor to John McCain. So again, political postures and orientations, as far as we're concerned in this program, mean nothing. We're interested in who's got a grip on reality. And Mark Zandi came up with this. He says an $800 billion recovery plan could produce $3.1 trillion over the next 4 years in terms of productivity. 4 times the cost, a lot more, actually much more optimistic than Christina Romer.
Yes.
And so he's saying, gee, you put up less than $1 trillion now, you get $3 trillion back in productivity later. That's pretty amazing if he's right. Now he's saying that the gross domestic product will be about $1 trillion higher, both in 2010 and, 2011 and 2012, if this package is implemented. So if, and here we practically can read it, if Zandi's GDP estimates are anywhere close to correct, then the net fiscal cost would be very modest. Well, it actually might be the other way. We might have a gain. Might have a gain.
Yeah.
And due to the higher tax revenues, because you get all this extra productivity, then you get more tax revenue.
Yep.
That reduces your deficit. And so therefore, you have a better tax revenue base, and you have lower deficits than you would have had without the stimulus package, which is interesting. It's a paradox, but there it is. And this is both sides of the aisle talking here.
Yeah, that's right.
So we get back to economic solutions. We're getting to the point that maybe this stimulus package that is up right now looks like a lot of money, but in terms of productivity, it actually might be quite modest. And okay, you corrected me that Barack Obama actually did say $2 trillion or so.
That's right.
Well, that was my independent view, that it was going to be $2 to $3 trillion.
Right. Just
looking at collapse of values. And that's not to say that all prices should remain high. The name of this game, I don't want to have to see an average person's, half of that person's salary supporting a child in just a tuition for a year in college.
Well, it's clear that house prices cannot stay where they are.
Exactly. And so these prices do have to come down. But part of what we're going to be doing in our series in future programs, we're going to show how we can aid the individual and the family in order to weather this storm, not just the big guys and the big producers and everything else, and to save the economy in general. We're going to talk about how do you get through one of these economic depressions to where everybody can do it. Even if the prices do come down, can you then afford to send your kids to school? Can you afford health care? So many things that are so expensive today. Housing is so terribly expensive. That debt is what drove those prices up. And I do hold the Federal Reserve accountable for that. And our government, and certainly Mr. Volcker, is not talking about that. Okay. Well, recommendations. Well, based on what we've looked at, you could read the top
The
one.
first one is very clear, I think. Implement some sort of a plan like the Obama plan. I'm sure the House and Senate will come to some sort of understanding about it, and it should be very close to what we see now.
Okay. And my position on this, Federal Reserve is largely responsible, created the monetary basis for this boom that has caused this bust. We cannot have this if we want to prevent these kinds of things of recurring. We saw this happen in the roaring 20s and the crash and Great Depression. It was 62% increase in the money supply. We had hundreds of percent increase in the money supply this time. That graph that we looked at earlier, where you saw that steep curve that just went just like this, far more drastic than the 1920s monetary increase.
That's right.
So based on that, my view is we do need to get back to a gold standard after we do all this major recovery spending.
But you're not talking about an international gold standard
I'm
here,
talking
where
about,
you would be, where we, you know,
no, just
we don't want to do that
States.
again. That was a bad, that was a
the
bad
United
idea.
States. What I'm talking about is peg our money to gold. That's what I'm saying. To put a lock on the Federal Reserve from being able to create unlimited amounts of money through bank credit.
I think we're not completely done with that, though. I mean, there's more regulation that's going to be needed in terms of because there were some real excesses.
Yes, there were. We need regulation. There's no question about that. I want to see more of that. I want to lock down the Federal Reserve. I do hold them accountable for this, even though there were all the hipsters and all of the derivatives and everything else that took advantage of selling the same house and package of homes 10 times. After the first time, it was valueless, really.
Yeah.
So that needs to quit, and regulations need to be put in place. But people like Ron Paul and Peter Schiff take a very jaundiced view, and I believe justifiably so, at the Federal Reserve's role in this and the fact we should get back to at least a gold-backed money system in the United States, similar to what happened in the 1930s, where maybe 35% of your money has to be represented by gold. It doesn't mean you're trading it, but it has to lock that money supply.
I think that happened. That we left that in about 1931 or 32, actually.
Actually, we never completely went off the gold-backed money until Richard Nixon.
That's right, Richard Nixon. That's right.
And then Lyndon Johnson got rid of silver.
Yes,
and then that was the final deal. So my view is, we have to discipline the Federal Reserve. There's no way to do it legally, in my opinion. It never happens. So I'm advocating return to gold, but only after quite a number of years.
I think we need to recover from this.
We need to recover first, and I'm in agreement that we need to implement the Obama plan immediately. I have one reservation in the Obama plan, doesn't show on this slide.
Right.
But the Obama plan calls for $100 million of aid to faith-based charities. And first of all, that is contrary to separation of church and state. And if there were any aid to be administered by faith-based organizations, my requirement would be that they can't get any money out of this themselves directly at all. They have to do this on a voluntary humanitarian basis, just as they normally operate. I wonder, do you have the statements?
I have this, I'm going to read this because I want to get it right.
Yeah.
This is, the beginning is, the first one's from Thomas Jefferson, a letter to Danbury, Connecticut Baptist Association, where he says, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state.
That's where the wall of separation idea came from.
This is the Establishment Clause.
All right. Okay.
And the second quote is from James Madison, a letter from 1803 objecting to the use of government land for churches. And I can see how this is important. The purpose of separation of church and state is to keep forever from these shores the ceaseless strife that has soaked the soil of Europe in blood for centuries.
Okay, they felt very strongly about this, and of course the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights is about having no law that enacts any kind of government religion or state religion, as well as freedom of religion and freedom of speech.
Yes.
Also, Article 6, Section 3 of the Constitution calls out there shall be no religious test for holding public office in the United States.
That's right.
So even if CNN wants to interview some candidate, technically they're not even supposed to ask that candidate what their religious background is, because that could constitute a test. But anyway,
I don't think that would stand up in court.
Well, it's the Constitution. It's Article 6, Section 3.
Yeah.
But
what constitutes a test is the question.
But my point is, if any faith-based organization, $100 million. My requirement would be that they don't get one penny of this themselves in terms of compensation, that they would only administer it, and then it might work.
I wouldn't be surprised if that's the way it works out.
Maybe that's the way it works out. If it didn't go that way, I'd want that money to go to the Super Collider. Yeah. Okay, well, I think you have any more comments?
No, I think that covers it for me.
Okay, I think we've provided a definition of what the key problems are in the crisis we have today. We did arrive at, what do you know, stimulus package does look good. It doesn't matter which party it is. We can see why George Bush administration started it and why it's
worked,
going on.
and it worked, and it did something back in the Great Depression.
Yes, except they, like you pointed out, they lost their nerve, and it took World War II where we had this tremendous spike.
Yes.
So anyway, we hope that everybody will have enjoyed this program, and we hope you'll look in on us next time. Thanks very much.